If you're like me, then at some point in your life you've been told or made to feel that you weren't good enough, that something was wrong with you, that your value as a human being was contingent on a set of things completely external to who you are. Maybe you were hurt as a result of a bad romantic relationship, or a series of bad romantic relationships, me. Or maybe it was your parents, friends, teachers, or someone else you trusted who made you feel like you weren't worthy of their or anyone else's affection, also me. Whatever the case may be, at some point in your life you suffered one or multiple injuries to your body and your sense of self. You were traumatized. And the effects of that trauma never went away. Maybe you told yourself a lie about how you were unworthy of other people's love in order to be able to move past those experiences of powerlessness. But you never really addressed the root of the problem. Eventually, those lies congealed into a set of bodily responses and mental patterns that have, in your life, impeded your ability to be your authentic self in different contexts. Like a snail, as you went through life, you grew a shell, and that shell was supposed to insulate you from life's harshest trials and tribulations, to protect you from its repeated pains, frustrations, and disappointments. But if you're like me, you've also gradually come to find out that you've been sold a false bill of clean health. Your shell didn't allow you to heal, even if it did allow you to move past certain traumatic experiences. In fact, your shell sometimes feels like a cage. It inhibits your movements and keeps you from taking risks that might expose you to failure or pain, even when those risks are things that you want to or ought to do, whether those actions pertain to your career, love life, or other sorts of interpersonal relationships. The psychologist Wilhelm Reich called this shell that I'm talking about character armor. He posited that those very visceral reactions that we experience when we are confronted with stimuli that we perceive as threatening to our fragile inner sense of self are called character resistances. But the thing is that our inner sense of self is always desperately trying to get out of that armor. This isn't always a good thing, because our inner sense of self can lead us to do some really fucked up shit, but the issue arises when that set of armor is too tight. It crushes our body and doesn't let even our most innocuous desires escape without a struggle. Instead, it represses them, and with them, it represses us. It keeps us from being free by telling us that we always have to wear masks in our everyday interactions with other people, because if not, they'll reject us. And in rejecting us, they'll prove the reality that we already know in our hearts, namely that we're not worthy of their love or affection.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
I've never seen a piece of media depict this all too tragic aspect of the human condition better than the second arc of Bakemonogatari. This is a story about how insecurities form in response to circumstances in life, what they do to shape our everyday patterns of thought and behavior, and how they hold us back from living happy lives with healthy relationships by compelling us to defend our fragile egos through inauthentic behavior that is, on balance, hurtful to ourselves and other people. Let's start with Koyomi. Beyond the surface level reason for why he's at the park on a Sunday afternoon, namely that he got in a fight with his sister and that he doesn't want to be at home during Mother's Day, why is he at this location? Koyomi is at this park for the same reason that he is initially unable to reciprocate Senjokahara's romantic feelings for him when she first confesses to him in episode 3, which is kind of the driving force of why he's run away from home. Koyomi feels like he is an irresponsible person, and because he feels that he is an irresponsible person, Koyomi believes that he is doomed to forever disappoint the people closest to him, whether those people be his family members or his future significant others. To paraphrase his sister and his mother, who have contributed to the cementing of this lie as a part of Koyomi's identity, he feels that he is forever condemned to remain a child emotionally and psychologically, even as he grows into an adult's body. That is to say, Koyomi worries that he is forever doomed to remain immature, even as his life changes and his body and the people around him grow up. It is mainly for this reason, and not for a lack of reciprocal sentiment, that he initially turns down Senjokahara's proposition to enter into a formal romantic relationship. He doesn't want to disappoint her, so he'd rather avoid the risk of committing to anything more serious than a friendship that they have already developed. The story that Koyomi is an irresponsible person is of course a lie. Koyomi may at times act irresponsibly. Other factors aside, when he fell behind in his studies upon entering high school, that was due to his own failure to prioritize his academics. When he chose to run away from home on Mother's Day because he felt unworthy of his mother's love, that too was an act of irresponsibility. But those irresponsible acts don't make Koyomi an irresponsible person. They don't define him, and they certainly don't make him someone who's unworthy of love. People like Senjokahara and even Koyomi's sisters, who insist that he elect to stay at home to celebrate Mother's Day, see this, even if Koyomi can't at times. What's more, the idea that Koyomi Araragi is an irresponsible person is contradicted by what we've seen of him so far throughout the show. Thus far, we know him as the guy who went out of his way to help a complete stranger, Hitagi Senjogahara, acknowledge and begin to heal from the traumatic events of her past. We also know him as the guy currently trying to help Mayoi Hachikuji find her way to her mother's house, even though Mayoi viciously rejected his assistance at first and has proceeded to emotionally lash out at, deceive, and even physically bite Araragi. Those are not the actions of an irresponsible person. In fact, Hitagi's wish to grant Araragi a favor in return for the assistance and genuine friendship that he provided to her is an example of a budding reciprocal relationship built on mutual responsibility. He's just too in his shit, by which I mean caught up in his insecurities, to realize that. And the thing about insecurities, and really about overly restrictive character armor and resistances, is that they operate with reference to what we can call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Coined by the sociologist Robert Merton in 1940, the self-fulfilling prophecy is a way of describing the power of meaning that human beings make about their actions. The basic idea is that when we define a situation in a certain way, we are more likely to behave in ways that lead us to make that situation a reality. Like prophets, we are then likely to retroactively point back at the trail of tears behind our actions and declare, "See, didn't I tell you so? I always knew she was gonna leave me. He was gonna break my heart. My business was gonna fail. My friends would abandon me. The economy was gonna fall into shambles." Not the economy. Donald Trump was gonna get elected. Thank God he didn't. And also, yay for creepy Uncle Joe, I guess. In any case, I think the way to think of insecurities is as the panicked, anxious, and powerless states of being that trigger and are triggered by those instances in which your character armor bumps into a perceived threat. In other words, insecurities are, to use psychoanalytic terms, bundles of repressed libidinal energy that coagulate into character traits and symptoms, i.e. irrational mental and behavioral patterns, in an economic framework where the input of energy must be offset by the output of energy and vice versa to keep your body in a state of kinetic equilibrium. Okay, I know that was a lot, but basically what I'm trying to say is that at the instance where your ego feels a threat, there's a reason for your character resistances to kick in, either in your superego, your socially acquired sense of morality, self-flagellating you in the form of a guilty conscience, or through sadistic impulses to seek revenge channeled at another person. That reason is that your body is kind of trying to retain a sense of balance in the midst of all the chaos. But it also means that, like Araragi, we don't have to risk opening up to other people who may love us at the expense of having to face up to the parts of ourselves that we need to work on. For Hitagi, something that she needs to work on in this arc is her audacity, her willingness to tell Araragi the hard truth even when she feels like she might be wrong or like her brutal honesty might hurt his feelings and cause him pain. Recall that the central dilemma faced by Hitagi during the last arc centered on her unwillingness, or rather her perceived inability to tell herself and others the truth about the trauma she had experienced when her mentally ill mother allowed a cultist to almost rape her and then disappeared from her life. Hitagi felt ashamed of what happened to her, and so rather than confronting it as a part of her inner being that she needed to heal, she elected to give her memories of her mother away to the crab god. Just because she was able to repress her memories, however, didn't mean that she was able to undo their physical and emotional toll on her body and mind, this being symbolized by how she lost the vast majority of her body weight. In any case, Hitagi's narrative in this arc is about the overcoming of a character resistance that remained after she confronted the traumatic events of her past in the last arc, namely her inability to tell the hard truth. Despite the fantastical narrative of instant recovery that we would all like to believe, the reality is that trauma and insecurities don't just go away when we resolve ourselves to confront rather than repress them. As most people who have had to go through a traumatic experience could probably tell you, even equipped with the capacity to identify and combat our triggers, undoing the memory work and bodily effects of trauma is a long and arduous process. One does not simply loosen the character armor once and for all, especially when there are situations and people aplenty who have the capacity to plunge us back into the pits of self-loathing. For example, the first instance where Hitagi's inner struggle to tell the truth manifests in this arc is early in episode 3. Most of this episode is spent with Hitagi and Araragi playing games with each other, a motif that is nicely accentuated by, that scene where they actually play games with each other. Anyways, when Hitagi encounters Araragi, she is quite coquettish towards him, expressive of her feelings in her body language but evasive in her words. She claims to have worn a seductive set of clothing that day not because she was in search of his validation, but rather because she would like him to desire her. In other words, she tries, and fails, to use a ruse to avoid confessing her true feelings. To this end, at multiple points, she either sits down right next to Araragi or gets physically close to him, evoking the sensuousness of physical intimacy. And yet, despite Araragi noticing the confessional nature of her bodily posture and vocal tonality, he is unwilling to ask her out, due to his image of himself as irresponsible. So what does she do? Instead of facing up to her feelings right off the bat, she drags out the encounter. She even explicitly says that she'd like them to get to the point where they can be friends of equal status. What she then does is paper over her fear of asking him to define their relationship through tactics meant to elicit a confession out of him, so that she can have a sense of manufactured security through power over him. For example, Hitagi says that she is grateful to Araragi for the services rendered by him in the previous arc, where he was the main catalyst that helped her begin to cope with her trauma. Although, as her repeated statements in this arc evince, she does feel this way, she proceeds to offer to reciprocate his kindness with a favor, hoping that he'll ask her to be his girlfriend. But she can't even bring herself to be direct about her wish, so instead she lists a number of erotic, intimate, or instinctual acts as alternative. All of this builds until she realizes that he is not going to propose that they get into a relationship, at which point she asks him if he wants a girlfriend, and she implies her willingness to fill that role. Insecurities often enable each other, so what transpires is that he lets his shit get in his way, rejects a proposal due to his irresponsibility rather than any lack of romantic feelings. Things really kick into gear during the remainder of the arc, however, as Hitagi goes along with Koyomi's desire to help Mayoi Hachikuji return to her mother's house. She does this, importantly, even though she cannot see the Snail girl. Once again, what we have here is an example of Hitagi's central lie manifesting itself through her character armor and its accompanying resistances. She cannot bring herself to tell the truth to Koyomi for two main reasons. Number one, she likely feels that she does not want to hurt Koyomi's feelings. This is because, as she states in episode 3, she does not have very many people she is personally close with. As such, she probably does not want to risk losing Araragi. After all, for 2 years she was practically alone and living with trauma due to her inability to own up to its existence and her successful attempts at pushing others away. Second, Hitagi probably felt crazy as a traumatized person living in a state of consciousness and being altered by a supernatural crab. Unable to recount her tale to other people without them thinking her a lunatic, Hitagi probably felt isolated for a very long time. As such, despite what she knows about Araragi's connection to the spiritual realm, in her mind it is plausible that there's something wrong with her, and that this is the reason why she can't see Mayoi Hachikuji. Even if it is the case that there isn't something wrong with her, she's still hesitant to tell Araragi the truth out of fear of making him feel like he's abnormal or that there's something wrong with him, an experience that she's sadly all too familiar with. In fact, this charade continues all throughout episode 4 and even going into episode 5, that is until Hitagi speaks to Oshino. Our resident spiritual healer / psychotherapist / priest, Crucify Me Daddy, is able to relate to her that, in fact, the reason why she cannot see the apparition is because it only appears to those who want to avoid returning to a turbulent home situation. In episode 4, Hitagi even goes so far as to walk around in circles as she attempts to guide Araragi and Mayoi to the house of Mayoi's mother. She blames herself multiple times for her inability to lead them to this location. One of the most analytically relevant moments in this arc happens in this long walk, when Araragi, Mayoi, and Hitagi all seemingly interact. Araragi is prompted by Mayoi's general apprehensiveness vis-a-vis Senjogahara to ask the latter if she doesn't like children, after which we get a profoundly insightful anecdote and answer. Confirming Mayoi's suspicion that Senjogahara is hostile towards her and towards children in general, the latter recounts a story of a time in her middle school years when she ran into a small child and then proceeded to instantly apologize for knocking the child over. In Hitagi's mind, it was not so much anything the child did wrong that made her despise them or other children like Mayoi. Rather, it was the child's power to render Hitagi subservient that is to blame. There are several ways to read this encounter, but I choose to read it as evidence of how insecurities work. Whether you're Freud, Jung, Reich, or most other conventional psychologists and psychiatrists, it is generally accepted that early childhood and I believe adolescence are crucial stages in the development of a person's psyche and character. As such, the traumas that we experience in our homes or outside of them during these periods in our lives when we are relatively dependent and powerless in relationship to our parents, friends, and other authority figures such as teachers, priests, or other adults, tend to become seared into our conduct and character traits such as impulsiveness, anality, passivity, etc. And in convenient stories, we tell ourselves in moments of duress to justify certain behaviors. It is these patterns that make up what Wright called character armor, and it is our bodily and mental impulses to lash out at someone else or at ourselves that can be identified as the resistances that we experience vis-a-vis triggering external phenomena. As I said before, for Hitagi, that child, that insecurity, is telling herself and other people the hard truth, just like for Koyomi, that child is his belief that he is an irresponsible person who is not worth loving. Both of our main characters experience feelings of guilt and shame, or internalized superegoistic repression, as a psychoanalyst might say, as a result of their actions. Koyomi refers to the dark feelings that come rushing into his mind when he stops to think about why he ran away from home, as well as his general pettiness, or his propensity to overreact at the most trivial matters. For Hitagi, on the other hand, her guilt is communicated to us in a scene where she's lying to Koyomi while a sign behind her reads "not guilty" and "guilty" over and over again, indicating her thought spiral in regard to this matter. When you put two and two together, what you get is a relationship where Koyomi and Hitagi have these beautiful moments of relating with each other and joking about shit, like Hitagi being the wish-granting Shenron from DBZ. At the same time, both of them act inauthentically to each other with respect to their romantic feelings, and with respect to the situation with Mayoi Hachikuji. This arc can be seen as a narrative journey that aims to resolve those insecurities to make possible a budding romance. However, like many things in life, this path is marked by numerous deviations and wrong turns. The avatar of these wrong turns is our favorite snail girl, Hachikuji. In addition to being a person, or a spirit I should say, Hachikuji is an embodiment, or at the very least, a mirror for Hitagi and Koyomi's insecurities. In fact, there's this nice little motif sprinkled throughout this arc in the form of circles that appear in the eyes of most people who interact with Hachikuji, which I think lends credence to this idea. So, who is our infamous snail girl, and what is the nature of her situation? Well, Mayoi Hachikuji was a real person whose parents split up when she was a young child. Soon after, she was forcefully separated from her mom and put into the custody of her dad, whose ill will towards Mayoi's mom led him to strip Mayoi of the opportunity to form a relationship with her mom. Suffering from the grief and anguish of having forgotten her mother's face, Mayoi wandered off on her own one day. In an attempt to make it over to her mother's house, she admittedly walked across the street knowing that the light was green and was hit and killed in a car accident. Shortly thereafter, she was reincarnated as a lost cow, a spirit bound to wander the earth. Unable to reach her destination, she was thereafter fated to mislead those wishing to stay away from their homes by leading them on a futile and misfortunate pilgrimage. That's literally her name, guys. See, I told you it would come back, until they abandoned her. So there's a lot to unpack about Mayoi's character arc in these 3 episodes, but to start off, it makes sense to focus on the behavior that made Aragi feel compelled to help her, namely her blatant aggressiveness to those who approach her. Essentially, Mayoi tells everyone who tries to help her to fuck off and leave her alone. She then proceeds to do everything in her power to push them away, including fighting, insulting, and literally biting them. At a metaphorical level, we can see Mayoi's actions here as symbolically connoting what it's like to actually confront one's insecurities. It can feel like a struggle to acknowledge and act against your socially conditioned responses to certain situations, especially when every fiber of your being is yelling at you to run the fuck away or to act as you have in the past to protect yourself. At the level of character psychology, we can view Mayoi's actions serving as her own form of character armor. She doesn't want to lead people astray in a seemingly fruitless pilgrimage bound to end up in her abandonment. So instead, she lashes out at them, hoping to save them and herself from further pain. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy that leads to abandonment too. This is ironic since we can reasonably suppose that given the way that Mayoi clings to Koyomi throughout the arc and her own abandonment issues vis-a-vis her mom, this is the outcome that she desires the least. In fact, it's entirely possible that Mayoi, who has been in this position for years, has had many experiences of people acting like Hanekawa. They walk up to her, are friendly for a little bit, and then leave her behind shortly thereafter, either due to her aggressive behavior towards them or their realization of her nature as a spiritual entity. Her status as a suicide is also worth pondering, as it seems to imply that an outcome of being consumed by one's insecurities is the experience of a literal death of self, an idea I kinda see as possible. Nevertheless, what makes this arc so instructive is the way Mayoi serves as a catalyst for the development of 2 types of authentic relationships that can act as a counterbalancing force to character armor. First, we have the example of the authentic platonic relationship that develops between Mayoi and Koyomi. Over time, Koyomi grows to care about Mayoi as a friend. A lot of this has to do with his proclivity towards helping others through difficult situations, a character trait that Senjo Kahara points out near the end of this arc. However, what is striking is how he perseveres in his desire to help Mayoi, even knowing full well that she had elected to deceive him into following her on a fruitless odyssey. What we see Koyomi demonstrate in this instance is genuine empathy. He is grounded in an understanding of who the other person is, flaws and all, that goes beyond the self-serving nice guy attitude and sacrificial masochism of a savior complex. Although to be fair, that is kind of something Koyomi struggles with in a later arc. Koyomi knows that many of Mayoi Hachikuji's actions were actively harmful, but he can pierce beyond superficial moralizing explanations that might see her outbursts as a product of an intrinsically rotten character. He can understand them for what they really are, the actions of a hurt and frightened child torn between wanting to protect others from the harm she might bring their way, while hoping to find companionship, and along with that companionship, a resolution to her own abandonment issues. So instead of walking away from her when Senjo Gahara suggests this as a proper course of action to defeat the lost cow, Koyomi, after convincing Hitagi to help, chooses to persist in helping Mayoi. They take the hard road, both literally and metaphorically. Literally, Hitagi and Koyomi take winding back roads to arrive at the supposed address of Mayoi's mom. Metaphorically, they brave through the difficulties of helping a friend who is troubled find closure. What our main characters discover upon their arrival is that the house belonging to Mayoi's mom is no longer there. She's gone. She has abandoned Mayoi. But instead of this being a moment of despair, we see Mayoi experience a sense of closure. This emotion is symbolized by her excitedly running to her mom's home as she's covered in a shroud of light that disappears her from our earthly plane. The scene coincides with a theme that is present from the very beginning of this arc. When Senjo Gahara and Araragi talk about how the surrounding area where Hitagi used to live has changed, both recognize such change as a part of life. They also, however, note the impact of such changes upon their psyche. As Senjo Gahara puts it, knowing that change is a part of human existence is not enough to keep her from feeling like her motivation is cut off. In other words, knowing that change happens is not enough to keep us from feeling overwhelmed by it. Paradoxically, however, what we discover when we lean into insecurity is that it's less draining than cleaving to a false sense of security. Like Mayoi, we can find out that our parents abandoned us, but by giving up the past, we can come to grapple with present reality on our own terms. We can be more or less free. We can loosen our character armor simply by exposing ourselves. On this topic of exposure, I don't think there's a better example of its benefits than in the other example of a healthy, authentic relationship that develops in this arc. That's right, motherfuckers, I'm talking about Hitagi and Koyomi's relationship. Near the end of episode 5, once Hitagi has owned up to and apologized for lying to Koyomi, and once Koyomi has resolved himself to go back home, both parties have a second romantic exchange. Hitagi asks for Koyomi to answer her earlier question about whether they can be in a relationship. At this point, she owns up to her earlier ruses and boldly declares that she had intended to proposition him all along, as she has developed special feelings for him. In accordance with his true feelings, Koyomi then takes the risk to agree to be together with Hitagi on one condition. In what is a nice resolution to Hitagi's issues with telling the hard truth and Araragi's fear of responsibility, he proposes that they must responsibly talk through their issues rather than hide things or lie to each other out of their own sense of insecurity. Hitagi accepts, laying the groundwork for a healthy relationship that from the get-go can work as a means for both parties to grow as human beings while shedding grace on each other for their faults. The persistence of these faults is arguably symbolized in Mayoi's stutter. Feigned or real, Mayoi's stutter refers to a speech disorder after all, or a momentary deviation from perfect communication. On the whole, this arc is about confronting our insecurities, about building healthy relationships with our friends and significant others, relationships where we aren't afraid to work on ourselves, lean into insecurity, and be our authentic selves, warts and all. And yet, it's instructive to note that at the end of the last episode of this arc, Mayoi comes back. She tells Araragi that she is no longer an earthbound spirit, perhaps meaning that she is no longer a spirit that is bound to a fragile egoic foundation. She has now been promoted to the rank of a wandering spirit. In other words, she is a spirit that travels back and forth between different realms, which perhaps means different layers of the psyche in this context. Along these lines, we see the ocular circles denoting psychological insecurities once again manifest in Koyomi's eyes. This scene delivers us the message present at the start of this arc that insecurity has a certain ontological status. That is to say, insecurity can be seen as a part of what it means to be a human. We don't really know how our actions will impact the world, just as we don't really know what will happen when we take the risk to ask another person out or open our hearts, knowing that we've been disappointed time and time again in the past. But ultimately, in a certain sense, whether or not we choose to come out of our shells is up to us. There are other factors to consider, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we are the authors of our lives. Self-fulfilling prophecies can cut both ways, good and bad. So get out there, my little prophets, my toxic priests, and live life to the fullest within your capabilities. You sincerely deserve it. Peace, and thank you for watching this video.